So I guess it's working perfectly, and thank you so much again for introducing me. And it's my pleasure today to present the initial results of my research on Miseducating medievalisms in contemporary public discourse in Russia here at my alma mater at Central European University. And let's get straight to it so that we do not lose time. So it has been already stated multiple times in the scholarship that the Middle Ages and medievalism, so the common stereotypes about the period defined by Louis Darsan, Robert Utz, and others are actually a quite powerful educative medium which can reproduce some stereotypes about the period and affect our understanding of it. I mean, the medievalisms have become so powerful and so useful that sometimes they can transmit even some political agendas, including some far-right discourses, as I have indicated here on the slide as to historiography. But in the Russian milieu, the problem is that following the Western methodology, some Russian medievalisms are, for some reason, studied either through some cultural or artistic lenses. And hence, the political discourse or political implications of the Middle Ages are either omitted or presented one-dimensionally, so to say, because the research we currently have at hand about the political uses and abuses of the Middle Ages in Russia cover mostly memory politics, that is the erection of some historical monuments, but not the public discourse. The only exception from this trend is a wonderful quite recent contribution of the last year by Kati Parpey, which studied Putin's state speeches and addresses to the parliament and the people. So the current presentation will be an attempt to fill in this gap. And in doing so, I'll address two research questions indicated here on the slide. So basically, I want to see what medievalist concepts are reproduced in the Russian milieu and why, and how they are used by pro-state affiliated Russian media and independent media as well. And the initial hypothesis I had at hand when starting this research was actually affected by some propagandistic booklets released last year by some independent medias. So the propagandistic booklets of the Russian state, of course. And it was indicated there that the Russian medievalisms are used for three reasons. That is to advocate Russian expansionist external policy, also while doing this oppose the decay in West and promote anti-Ukrainian militarization. So hence I thought that probably the usage of medievalism somehow increased when the full-scale war in Ukraine erupted. So we will see whether I was right or wrong. As to methodology, I have chosen the chronological period of 8 years from 2014, when the crisis in Ukraine started, till 2022, when the full-scale war began. I compared two sources, a state-owned Kommersant and an independent Novaya Gazeta, which some of you may know because 1 year ago it got the Nobel Peace Prize. And methodologically, I used a threefold instrumentarium. So I combined comparative discourse analysis to study the quality of discourse about the Middle Ages. I used descriptive statistics to see how these trends developed chronologically, and contextualization. So I compared the discursive peaks to the Russian memory politics. Several notes should be made on the general selection of articles for my discourse analysis. Because if you run a basic search at any newspaper and you just put the Middle Ages, probably the general group you get will not be representative. So therefore, I ran some basic search for keywords such as medieval and the Middle Ages, and also I picked some historical persona mentioned in the propagandistic booklets, namely the 13th century Great Duke Alexander Nevsky, the 16th century Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible and his master called the Prichnina, so he is more or less aka Henry VIII with his mass terror and confiscation of monastic lands. And I excluded all the instances where the Middle Ages were used in their literary meaning, or where the mentioned persona were used to call some places, objects, and so forth. So for example, a boat called Alexander Nevsky was not included in my analysis. And I was able to single out three Miseducating medievalisms, which were used in many instances, mainly three clusters relating to culture, external and internal politics. Obviously, first such medievalism is the use of the Middle Ages itself. And in the pro-state media Kommersant, you can see several discursive notes that I was able to single out relating to this concept. I will not cite all of the instances, you can see them on the slide, but generally the trend is that over half of the usage of the Middle Ages is, first of all, negative. So here the discourse reproduces the Renaissance stereotype about the dark and barbaric Middle Ages, and it is mostly used to mildly criticize some internal affairs, such as, for example, if sewers do not work in a certain city, they will use something related to the Middle Ages. It is dark, barbaric, dirty, and so forth. As to some external politics, several discursive notes were singled out, and mostly they were relating to anti-Islamic rhetoric, the Western sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation, the rhetoric of the decaying West opposing the true Russian politics, and obviously Ukraine and the war erupted there. But the highest peak actually was not about the war, but about the incapability of the Ukrainian government to cope with the coronavirus crisis in 2020. As opposed to this, the independent Novaya Gazeta used the Middle Ages much more, so the number of hits was at least twice as high as in Kommersant, because in Kommersant I got almost 300 hits, and in Novaya Gazeta it was almost 600. Again, the majority of the use was about internal affairs, over 60%, and the discourse was strictly negative because over 80% of the hits were either about anti-Putin rhetoric, and you can see examples on the slide, internalized nationalism about some regions in the Russian Caucasus, Russia's pessimistic perspectives after the crisis of 2014, so the war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, and of course, probably the largest discursive note, the governmental repressions against the Russian opposition. In the external discourse, we have more or less the same notes, that is anti-Islamistic rhetorics, where the Middle Ages are used more or less in the same context, the politics with the West, where the Middle Ages are used to criticize the Russian stance on the West, and Ukraine, where the Middle Ages are used to address again the Russia's expansionist politics. While the Middle Ages in general are used obviously in this predictable way, probably it's more interesting to look at some Miseducating medievalisms relating to some concrete personas. And the first such Miseducating medievalism is Ivan the Terrible and his mass terror called Oprichnina. And back then, when I was a student at the Moscow State University, like 10 years ago, so the generally accepted historiography on this figure was strictly negative. So the assessment of the policy conducted by Ivan the Terrible was mostly negative. However, what we can see here in the Kommersant is that the discourse is either negative, is either neutral or positive, which totally contradicts the widely accepted historiography about this figure. And the peak indicated here in 2016 was caused by the state's erection of a monument devoted to this Tsar. But not only the Russia's memory politics somehow linked to this person, but also the discourse in the Russian State Duma whether to introduce or not a new military unit called the National Guard in 2016, which later was used to suppress some mass protests and run some repressions against the Russian opposition, was also using Ivan the Terrible and his Oprichnina in a positive context to draw the continuity between Ivan the Terrible and his personate army, which was running Oprichnina, and the current police in Russia. I have indicated here only one colorful citation, which more or less generally describes the discourse on this political figure. So the citation comes from the year 2014, where Ivan the Terrible is positively compared to the Russian President Putin, who in the same way united Russia, defended the state from the attacks of the West, and after all waged Oprichnina, which, and here I quote, we all need because the state is disintegrated by the opposition. So let's look at the case of Novaya Gazeta, and it's actually completely different, as you can see here on the slide. The number of hits is much higher, the number of peaks is much higher, the discourse is totally negative. And while we can still see here the peak, which was marked by the erection of the monument devoted to Ivan the Terrible, the rest of the peaks, again, address in the same way that in pro-state Commersant, address internal politics. They address some mass repressions against the opposition. They address some amendments which Putin introduced to advocate his authoritarian regime. And he is also used to, Ivan the Terrible, to criticize the state elections in different years, such as 2019, so the protests in Moscow because of municipal electoral campaign, amendments to constitution of 2020, and so forth, where some errors or some instances where the rules of true elections were broken, so to say. So I put here only one citation from Novaya Gazeta, which basically draws a historical continuity between Ivan the Terrible and his massive terror, Joseph Stalin, who actually advocated for Ivan the Terrible's politics and tried to adhere to it, and the contemporary situation in the Russian political milieu. So as you can see, the bloody Oprichnina and all of the atrocities which were done by Ivan the Terrible are compared to the state we currently have in Russia. So the citation comes from December 2021. Another interesting figure, which can also serve as a miseducating medievalism, so to say, but maybe less emotionally colored, is Alexander Nevsky, the 13th century duke, which is traditionally referred in historiography as an ambiguous figure who carefully maneuvered between the Mongols, who tried to subjugate Russia back then in the 13th century, and the West, who attempted several crusades to the Russian lands and tried to impose Catholic faith and so forth. Generally, this historiographical stance on this figure is neutral, but what we can see here in the pro-state affiliated medium is that the discourse is either neutral or positive. And the obvious peak we have as to the case of Alexander Nevsky, the one of the year 2021 and 2018, for example, are caused by Putin's memory politics, when he signed some decrees to commemorate the jubilees of this person's birth, or when Putin signed a decree to construct a new monument devoted to this persona. Again, as to the discourse, mostly it's related to internal politics. So the number of hits relating to external politics, Ukraine, Belarus, for example, and so forth, is super low. And the peaks that use Alexander Nevsky mostly address Russian historical memory politics. Sometimes he is also used to address the issues in Ukraine. So let's look how the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs actually referred to Alexander Nevsky in his interview to Kommersant, so the pro-state media, in December 26. Basically, Sergei Lavrov, the minister, says that Alexander Nevsky carefully manipulated the relationships with generally tolerant rulers of generally tolerant Mongols, in order to defend the Russian people and the Russian Orthodox faith from the approaching West. And this West basically tried to deprive Russia from his identity. Russia bent but did not break under the burden of Mongols. it was able to come out from this ordeal and be unified, and then it adhered to the Byzantine Empire. In the case of the independent Novaya Gazeta, the usage, I mean, the chronological usage of Alexander Nevsky is mostly the same, so that is why I did not put the graph here. But the tonality of discourse is, well, not drastically, but slightly different. It's either negative or neutral, and the positive instances, well, there are just a few of them. Again, the Duke is used to criticize internal affairs and criticize Putin's memory politics and the restoration of the medievalist memory. But I put here only one positive instance where the Duke is used, and this instance is a citation from an interview of a Russian soldier coming back from the Ukrainian front line to Russia. Here, the Duke Alexander Nevsky is used as an exemplar of a soldier who obeys the orders of its motherland, so basically the state. And the soldier says that war and killing people is basically not a sin if it is an order. So if you defend your country, you're like Alexander Nevsky, so you're doing the right thing. And well, if I didn't know the date, probably I would have thought that this citation comes from the last year or the current year, but it actually comes from 2015. So therefore, I guess I still have some time for conclusions. So let us quickly draw, well, a line that medievalisms in the current Russian political milieu have become quite powerful educative idioms and mediums which can be used as to some cultural issues, external politics and internal politics. However, contrary to my initial hypothesis, the external discursive nodes are not so massive, and mostly the historical persona, for example, Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible, Oprichnina, and the Middle Ages in general, are referred to address some internal issues within the country. So both state-affiliated medium and the independent Novaya Gazeta actually reproduce the Renaissance stereotype about the dark and barbaric Middle Ages, which is sad because it's been, well, several centuries since this stereotype exists, but okay. Ivan the Terrible and his mass terror are generally addressed as, well, as a new negative topic because it's quite emotionally colored. But mostly Ivan the Terrible is used to address terror, either positively or negatively, depending on the medium, as a way of ruling society, which is currently promoted in Russia. Alexander Nevsky, on the contrary, is a much less controversial figure, so the discourse tonality on him is mostly neutral, sometimes positive. And his figure is used to reject or to criticize the rejection of modern, hence like Western contemporary democracy, and substituted with the subordination to the motherland. And here I must conclude that, again, these figures and these idioms are used not only as to some external cases, as I thought about the war in Ukraine, for example, but as to culture and mostly as to internal issues. So more research should be done on this, and I'll be presenting on it later on this month and the following months. And generally, I will very much welcome any comments and questions from your side. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olga, for your very enlightening presentation. I'm pretty sure you will get many questions later. So now let's move on our second participant. He is Brian Egede-Pedersen, who has a master's degree in history and English. He is a teacher in Denmark's upper secondary school, for which he won the Teacher of the Year award. Brian is a former lecturer at the University of Southern Denmark and has worked also as a consulting editor for the Ministry of Education. So, Brian, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan. I hope you can all hear me and you can all see my PowerPoint.
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. So first, yeah, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Olga for an absolutely fantastic paper. You're a tough one to follow. So the title of my paper is "Wait, Some People Actually Believe This," which is something that was uttered in disbelief by one of my students after working with memes and manifestos related to the Crusades and the Templars. So what I'm going to talk about here is using and teaching extremist content in the Danish upper secondary sector. Now, my questions that I'll try to answer over the next 20 minutes are: why does this approach that I take with teaching memes and manifestos make sense in the Danish upper secondary context? What is my theoretical pedagogical approach? How may Deus Vult memes and excerpts from extremist manifestos from Anders Behring Breivik and the Christchurch mosque shooter be taught? For instance, you see this quite obvious misappropriation of history on the front page of Breivik's manifesto, uploaded just before his terrorist attacks in Oslo in 2011, where he clearly riffs on the legacy and the memory of the Templars and his desire to create a new Templar order. And then, of course, what do my students say about encountering these memes and manifestos, including some of my students of Muslim descent? And my question, of course, to you, would any of this be of use to some of you? And what is our role as historians or history teachers? Now, before we can move on too much, I just need to very, very basically give you an overview of the Danish education system at a glance. And I promise I'll keep this as brief as possible. Practically compulsory is what we call the 0th to the 9th grade with an optional 10th grade. That is not my sector. My sector is what we call upper secondary school, which is for students approximately aged 16 to 19 and students who at least say that they want to move on to tertiary education afterwards, although not all of them do. In my sector, students can choose from 2 or 3 year programs, and the goals are not so much a set curriculum as it is obtaining personal autonomy and critical thinking in general. And this, of course, is where history plays a major part, and especially being able to understand, say, extremist content, because the entire sector is influenced by the German Bildung tradition, but modernized. So, for instance, students must learn about innovative competences, digital competence, global competence, and so on. And in terms of digital competences, teaching them how to handle something they're probably going to encounter online at some point, of course, makes a lot of sense. The exams are a mix of written and oral exams, and no exams are multiple choice. All exam material is new to the student. So this I deem differs quite a bit from many other sort of high school sectors. And this is quite difficult for a lot of students from non-academic backgrounds, but they still have to live up to these requirements. For history in the upper secondary sector in general, all students must take history either at A level if they choose a 3-year program, or at B level if they choose a 2-year program. And this is what the exam looks like at A level. It's a 30-minute oral exam with 90 minutes of preparation. The students will receive 3 to 5 pages of material, and they must be able to create questions on different levels. Whereas B level is just it's still a 30-minute oral exam, 60 minutes of preparation, decidedly less material, and here they receive questions. Once again, it must be stressed that there is no rote learning in this system. There are no required textbooks according to a national standard, which of course leaves quite a lot of leeway for all history teachers. We don't so much have a history curriculum in a traditional sense as goals for skill sets and competences. Yes, we must cover clash of ideologies in the 20th century. We must cover genocides, nature and technology, cultural encounters, and so on. But very few historical events or eras are mentioned in law, meaning it's pretty much up to the individual teacher. And no matter what, if it's A level or B level, all students must be comfortable with history's methodology and able to analyze practically everything on their own, including appropriation of the past. And they have no internet access here either. So it's just them and everything they've learned about competences and skills. Like I said, this is a tall task. So one way to try to make sure that all students can live up to this is what we call the 5 bricks model, because, well, Denmark is known for Lego, so obviously we play with bricks. This is intended to be introduced to all first-year history students, so they are aware that they must always cover center and bias, be aware of the influence of the context, and find the message, etc., and try to give them the words to begin with this. Once they understand all of this and once they have a solid foundation, that's when I move on to my theme about either the Crusades or cultural encounters as a specific theme, usually at the beginning of their second year. And this is also where the students encounter appropriation or misappropriation of the past, which is something I teach using this very, very simple model, asking the students, is the past used as a role model or as a cautionary tale? And no matter what you decide, dear students, you must ask why. Does it have something to do with the context? Does it have something to do with the sender? Well, you have to ask these questions. As for my theoretical pedagogical approach about teaching and communicating history, then I rely on two fellow Danes who are both scholars of pedagogy. One is also Egede-Pedersen, who talks about aesthetic learning. And aesthetic learning, in her definition, is that you try to almost attack as many senses of the students at the same time as possible, because some students will just assimilate and not really think about the new material they encounter, whereas what we really want as teachers and communicators is to have them accommodate their worldview to what it is they encounter. And this is where the aesthetic learning approach is supposed to give the students a mild shock and really just shake their foundations, to force them to think, reflect, and evaluate. And of course, using extremist content makes a lot of sense here because the students have to react to it, like you saw in the title of this paper. My other approach is a scholar called Stein Larsen, who stated that teaching history will always walk on two legs, an intellectual leg and an emotional leg. If we forget one, teaching history or communicating history will fall over. Now, this is the point where some of you might say, did he just reinvent pathos and logos? And yes, to a certain extent, he did. But it's a very useful tool for remembering that if history is only facts, then it will become boring. And if it's only emotion and excitement, then it will lose its scholarly value. So trying to use both of these legs at the same time is essential. And there, of course, is the humor found in memes and the often anger that is provoked by reading extremist manifestos that will count as the emotional part, whereas the students have a solid foundation of knowledge to understand everything with the intellectual leg. Another good term is the enchanted zone, a term that was originally coined by Swedish anthropologist Lotte Gustafsson when she studied historical reenactment. And what she noticed was that when people dressed up and were in a specific, often medieval setting, they would start behaving in different ways. They would play with identities. They would create what she calls a play chronotope, consisting of chronos and topos, a time and place where different rules apply. Memes are in many ways the same things because they are ambiguous, as I'll show you in a moment. They use humor, and that breaks down barriers. And also you can get away with more in memes than you can elsewhere. This is also, by the way, a great term for analyzing both role-playing or live-action role-playing, and of course also metal medievalism. I can see we have a few metal medievalists in the audience. This term is something I usually present to the students to help them build up that analytical framework, especially when we study memes. So let's move on to those. Memes are, of course, problematic sources because they are inherently vague. They are supposed to make you wonder whether you should take this seriously or not. So let's look at the Templar and Deus Book memes and how they often take refuge in audacity. For instance, we have this meme that is somewhat based on a sometimes school shooter related meme. Only here, the two children are provided with Crusader or Templar uniforms, and one of them hands the other one a note saying, "When I drop my quill, that's when we start slaying the Muslim kids, Deus Vult." Of course, this is so grotesque that it must be funny or not meant to be taken seriously, I guess, but there's that vagueness, almost an uncanny valley going on here, that we're not quite sure about what the actual intention is. But what I've seen is that using memes is really great for discussing a potential bias of a sender with my student. Their interest is piqued because it's different, but also because it references certain current real world issues. For instance, we have this meme, which is deadly serious, where a proud boy, or as they would sometimes call themselves, members of the fraternal order of the Old Knight, is ready to go out and beat up somebody, I suppose, while Templar is supporting him from the past. It's also an interesting way of teaching students the importance of context. For instance, Deus Vult memes really became a lot more popular at some point in 2016. And the students are usually able to figure out, did anything happen perhaps in the US that made the culture war and traditional values more central to everything? Then they understand the importance of context. And of course, it's not just online we're looking at, it's also how everything spills over into real life. This is usually a jaw-dropping moment for a number of students when they see so-called Templars storming the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021, complete with the Deus Vult banner on the left-hand picture. So what I have noted along the way is that a lot of students really take an analytical leap when we start studying this. Although we don't have a curriculum, like I said, they need to learn certain skills. And I could really see some basics of the historical method becoming a lot more clear and tangible to a lot of students right here. I noticed that my students become much better at looking up information about the sender. They become much more aware of bias and intention, and this is something that actually stays with them even at the exams. This is an example of a B-level exam with the first question, very basic, what were the Crusades? Analyze the depiction of cultural encounters during the Crusades, use material 1 and knowledge from our lessons. In this case, I used an excerpt from 1001 Nights. And discuss to what extent the Crusades are used as a role model or a cautionary tale in the present use materials 2+3, which are these two memes showing quite different legacies or memories of what happened during the Crusades and with the Templars. And all students actually show quite a bit of skill at critical analysis when they encounter this. But the students don't just study memes, they also study manifestos. They receive a number of quotes from the 2083, a European Declaration of Independence by Breivik, and also The Great Replacement by the terrorist from Christchurch. And just let me give you some examples of some of the quotes they receive. For instance, here we have the appropriation of history from Breivik, wanting to go back to the values found in the Middle Ages with the Templars. He plays on the popular culture idea that many students know from playing Assassin's Creed, for instance, that the Templars are also a secret society. We don't know how many Templars are out there. There were none. He just tried to play on that idea in popular culture. And of course, also the students can look at who are Bernard of Clairvaux and Jacques de Molay, and why does Breivik look up to those in particular. And the room usually becomes very quiet when we look at the last thing he writes before he moves on to carry out his terrorist attacks 2.5 hours later, how he signs himself Knights Templar Europe, Knights Templar Norway, that the past and appropriating it meant so much to Breivik. This is something that really shocks the students and makes them more interested in the Middle Ages and why it is appropriated. The other manifesto, The Great Replacement, is a bit more approachable to the students because it's more their style usually, but it's also more difficult to analyze because it is, to use the proper term, shitposting. For instance, we have the shouting part here. Ask yourself, what would Pope Urban II do? Is this supposed to be taken seriously? Apparently, yes, it is. And of course, a part of the manifesto is a Q&A saying who is truly to blame. The people who are to blame most are ourselves, European men. Strong men do not get ethnically replaced. Strong men do not allow their culture to degrade. Strong men do not allow their people to die. Weak men have created this situation. Strong men are needed to fix it. And when I ask my students if they have ever seen anything similar to this online, quite a few of especially the boys say, that is not too far away from some of the self-help videos and podcasts they encounter online. And there is a pipeline going from that to extremism in some unfortunate cases. And of course, then the terrorist starts shouting again, saying about the Hagia Sophia. We also use an image of one of the guns he used to carry out his terrorist attacks. This is pretty good for rudimentary research of the terms used, the names put on the gun, some of the historical events mentioned, and so on and so forth. Students actually become a lot better at figuring out historical references after we look at this because they have an interest of understanding extremism. Now, of course, this was just some of my observations, but the question is, what do the students have to say and what have they said over the past few years? I've carried out quite a few interviews with the students. Some of these interviews have been in depth, for instance, with these 4 during lockdown. Others have been more of a general class discussion. And the response has been uniformly positive so far. And a lot of students show quite an impressive amount of introspection about why this was interesting and which skills they acquired along the way. Something that usually also shocks the student, and I'll come to some more of their quotes in a moment, is this quote also from The Great Replacement, saying, be creative, be expressive, be emotional, and above all, be passionate. These are the things that speak to people, connect people, drive people. Okay, so far so good. Paint, write, sing, dance, recite poetry, hell, even meme. Create memes, post memes, and spread memes. Memes have done more for the ethno-nationalist movement than any manifesto. And this is where a lot of the students say, but they quite enjoy memes. They love looking at memes. They love going around Instagram and Reddit and finding, to quote one of the students, some really weird stuff my parents wouldn't understand. But they're starting to understand that there may be a bit more to it. And do we speak into a discourse of seeing the past in one way, and that is appropriating it in an extremist far-right direction? Some students are wonderfully honest, saying that it's easier to spot bias in a meme than the 50-page text. I've had that one several times in my interviews. And the students in general stress the connections between the national and the global, the past and the present in their world and the academic world. So it also helps them take a step further towards academia simply by understanding analytical terms and finding material on their own. They're also aware of the problems with memes and manifestos. There's often ambiguity. It's supposed to be edgy. There's that refuge in audacity and finding out how serious the senders are. So there's a lot of thinking going on. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the students has said, wait, if someone believes this, won't it make it easier to recruit them? Why do they believe it? So we have that spark of curiosity also, where some students actually kind of want to change the world, which is of course very inspiring for a teacher. But in general, the students say that history classes should help students discern facts from narratives and of course teach awareness along the way, which we're happy to hear about. My ongoing and very current studies are looking at how my Muslim students react, and I put Muslim in quotation marks because not all of my students from the Middle East and Africa and Afghanistan and so on identify as Muslims, although they say they're quite tired of people expecting them to be Muslims because they're actually atheists. I've not really been worried that looking at these memes and manifestos would radicalize any students, but I have thought about whether some of my Muslim students would feel alienated by looking at this. And these are some of the things that some of the students have said. Most of the students are second generation. They often feel torn between cultures, do not see themselves as particularly devout Muslims, but they're very aware of their cultural legacy. They come from very different backgrounds, and a lot of them have said that they often felt like outsiders in the primary school sector, but that changed when they got to my sector and started studying history and religion in a different way. So some of the quotes include, I'm always surprised when you learn that there's a new attitude out there, a worse one. You get used to that and don't take it personally. It's sad, actually. Extremism is interesting. I want to understand racism. You kind of know about Breivik and such, but here you get to analyze it in depth. One student even said, it's liberating to be reminded as a class that terrorism is not solely a Muslim thing. One of them said, I felt seen, especially when the teacher was clear that those in the Deus Vult crowd are in the wrong. And in the long run, we're going to encounter everything. We should do the same in school. This is eye-opening, which of course is just along the lines of what the Danish education system expects. But generally, the perhaps surprising conclusion I've reached so far by interviewing these students is that Muslim students feel included when we cover this. They actually feel seen in a way that they're not used to, which was not what I expected, but is just a reminder that I should probably keep doing this, and hopefully some of my fellow teachers will do so too. So on to my very, very final slide here. Obtaining digital competences and learning to understand the past that is appropriated online is sadly more relevant than ever. Right now, a 16-year-old Danish student is standing trial for joining the online neo-Nazi community Egede-Pedersen and allegedly planning a terrorist attack. These are some of the things that have been said in court. It's just images on the internet. You don't really think about it. The witness asked the defendant how to join Egede-Pedersen since it looked fun and cozy. He actually used the term hygge, if you know that from a fad a few years ago. Some people collect Pokemon cards, others collect manuals on how to construct bombs. Some of these comments are eerily similar to words from The Great Replacement, or even the concept of the enchanted zone, except in this case with the Egede-Pedersen, they leave that. And we once again see the liminality in memes. My naive hope as a teacher is not to reach the ones already here, in so far gone there, but those that might be swept up in a movement, or perhaps even have my students pull back their friends and acquaintances that are moving in a troubling direction. So final question for you for afterwards, was any of this useful to your sectors and your teaching? And what is our part to play in as historians in terms of creating historical consciousness? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for your interesting paper and for your approach to the topic, and for showing us the experiences of the students inside the classroom in the context of Denmark, but also I think it can be applied to many other places. So our next participant is Dr. Anna Adashinskaya, who is going to talk. He's going to present a paper on weaponization of historical mechanism and ideologization of textbooks in the context of modern Russia. Dr. Anna Adashinskaya is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Romanian Center for Russian Studies at the University of Bucharest. During the last years, she has been a member of the ERC project Art Historiographies in Central and Eastern Europe. She has completed her PhD in medieval studies at Central European University with a dissertation on practices of ecclesiastical foundation, sponsorship, and patronage in Byzantium and Slavic states. Her research focuses on medieval rituals of power and their historiography, royal and noble church patronage in the Orthodox Slavic states, and historiography on Byzantine and Slavic religious and artistic networks.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I don't have a very stable internet connection, so I switch my video off. And let's try to share. Okay. Yeah. As you see, I deal presently with this issue of propaganda through textbooks and through educational policies in Putin's Russia, or let's say better, second presidency of Putin. And you may notice that after 2012, so the second presidency, the two processes simultaneously took place in political landscape of Russia. So on the one side, it's increasing idealization and war politics promoted by political regimes, so including aggressive foreign policies, suppression of opposition, crackdown on public freedoms, and so on. And on the other hand, it's a process of digitalization of various public and governmental services, as well as education. So these two processes usually are not regarded in any case together. However, what I will try to prove partially from my paper is that
Anna, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't know if you're changing your slides because.
Do you see it? Change it now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. No. It's okay because they indeed get frozen. Okay. Yeah. So these processes, which are kind of independent, but they actually should be regarded together and in application to the educational developments in Russia. So the transformation of economy into digital economy in Russia started somewhere in the mid of the second presidency of Putin, about 2015, 2016. And you see that in 2018, digitalization and technological development were included into priority goals of Russian government by 2024. However, the processes themselves, they took place slightly earlier. And you see here a kind of chronology of digitalization of public administration in Russia. So we can date the beginning with 2010, something like this. when was system of SER created. Basically, it's a digital ID, digital passport of a person. At that point, it wasn't no more than just digital identification, so your access to portal of state services. But with development of 2014 and 15, we have incorporation of various public services into this online system, which in the end gave something which called in Russia Gosuslugi. So this is the left, maybe this is left picture. So this Gosuslugi, it's a portal integrating various public services, including the issuance of documents, the paying of fines, the making appointments to various administration and governmental organizations, and so on and so forth. And in 2015, with the update of this state portal, you can even order the passport and basically attach to your identification documents, like indeed the ID inside of the country, the foreign passport, the your car, driving license, and so on and so forth, including your military ID for men and for women who have military professions within this system. So in 2018 and further, the digital economy and digitalization of services became a priority within all these governmental initiatives. And the big push was given by 2020 with the COVID, when to the state, to the state portal, were attached also the certificates of vaccination. So they were attached to digital ID, as well as the fines related to the violation of coronavirus. What is important in this story is that exactly in 2020, Putin instructed his government to change this national program of digital economy initiated earlier into three main vectors. So the program to citizens, giving more public services, education and training for children, and health, formally promoted by distance learning during the coronavirus, and also distance medical appointments like telemedicine. To business, it promised to reduce drastically the cost and administrative pressure. And indeed, during the COVID lockdowns, the businesses could receive tax relief and postpone the tax payment through this systems of governmental public services portals. And to the state, which is very important, to create an effective invisible state and a new level of public security, which de facto means a new level of public surveillance, because through creation of the digital state, the actual state received access to all kinds of surveillance devices, including private CCTVs, which can be used effectively to crack down any protests, any kind of civil disobedience, and also to control you as a person through your access to public services on the digital media. And nowadays we see the very recently the outcome of these policies, that Russian men started to, potential conscripts started to receive their summons to go to the war with Ukraine through these public services portals, of course. What is important in our case is that the process of digitalization of education is also included, and it's ongoing, and potentially it will be attached to the private identification through this portal of state services. It's already partially attached, so you can choose a school and choose a program of for the class you are studying in. if you already have enough age. So I think it starts at like 12 or 13 when you can have a private ID. However, in parallel, the publishing house Просвещение developed the only possible for use at schools electronic form of a handbook. Why it's important for us? Because in fact, the state since at least 2013 starts to narrow down the possibilities of using of various handbooks especially in various disciplines, but history is especially underlined in Russian schools. Basically, it established a list of approved handbooks, and schools can select only among these approved handbooks. And as you see, these laws and its amendments, they basically narrow down the number of handbooks possible to use until by 2022, it's only one line of handbooks, because they are called training and methodology complexes. So it's not only the textbooks, but all accompanying materials. I will explain more precisely. So it's only one line of handbooks published by Просвещение publishing house is approved for usage at school. So you see, it's the complex of educational materials for one class on medieval history of Russia. So it includes 2 volumes of handbooks, maps, various notebooks for creative and home assignments, and so on and so forth. But they are educated by the same number of people and published by Просвещение Publishing House, which is important because this is the company which is formally affiliated in Cyprus, so it is still working in Cyprus, and it belongs to very close Putin circles, oligarchs, Arkady Rotenberg. So that's the main beneficiary of creating the only one single handbook for Russian schools. So all payments for this handbook will go directly to the Rotenberg Empire. On the other hand, the creation of single handbook makes strong argument for ideologization of education, because now there is only one possible truth, basically, so the only one interpretation of history given by these 4 editors of the handbook, among whom the main editor is actually a diplomat and international relations scholar, Torkunov, so he's not a medievalist. 2 others are historians of 19th century. I especially like this Alexander Danilov, whose PhD dissertation was dedicated to Komsomol as an active assistance of Communist Party in Gorbachev's time already. So they're basically career builders, and only one of them, Petr Sergeyevich Stepanovich, he is a professional scholar, medievalist, and actually he's a good scholar, much better than these handbooks, but I think the appearance of his name somehow sanctioned the materials written in this handbook, whatever interpretation of history they give. However, after working on this handbook, he was promoted to the head of educational programs, including medieval studies at higher school of economics. So it's a big step in your career working on this. So, and it's also important with the digitalization process that on occupied territories of Ukraine during this war, exactly this line of handbooks was spread to the students, the Ukrainian students, whom Russian, let's say, administration tried to convert to Russian ideology. And in this sense, the digitalization also gives big possibilities, so you don't need to carry the handbooks all over the place. You can simply demand to use it on various devices, including computer, even a phone. Okay, and then what is about history itself, what is written here? So these volumes which I look is to two first volumes, so it's only on medieval history. I will give you a couple of examples of, let's call it, doubtful and actually warmongering interpretations of history. So the handbook itself, in the difference with earlier Soviet and post-Soviet interpretations of history, it starts with so-called first city-states on the territory of our, as it's written, Russia country. And of course, the city-states are placed in Crimea, so occupied since 2014. And what is more importantly, one of the mentioned states, namely Olbia, is situated in Mykolaiv, close to Mykolaiv in Ukraine. So obviously it gives a nice casus belli because it's historically our in the interpretation of this handbook. Yeah, so it's even before the invasion in Ukraine, the part of South Ukraine is interpreted as our territory, as our country. More importantly, there are several discourses concerning Kiev and Russia. I'm not going into details what the state is, but you can suggest one interpretation as it was lax or kind of amorphous state formation of like 10th to 13th century, or it was a configuration of privately ruled lands of princes, which were connected by one dynasty that really keeps. But in any case, it's rather a polytonian. So there are many interpretations of it, but the interpretation promoted by the handbook is very specific. So first of all, the handbook introduces the concept of all Eastern Slavic statehood and old Russian people. Old Russian being replacement for Kiev and Rus, which the term got abandoned in all educational materials after 2014. It's a special topic. Which, so these old Russian people, the nice concept introduced to school students, they are united by submitting to the power of the Kievan prince. They are unified by military campaigns, and they define themselves as belonging to the Russian tribe. And they unified in common cause, using the same language and having the same religion of Christianity. It is exactly these features which in a speech written by the article on unity of Russians and Ukrainians written by Putin 1 year before the invasion of Ukraine. So exactly this feature, language, central power, religion, and feeling the common cause, they are taken as arguments that Ukrainians and Russians are the same nation. So the concept of nation is introduced here to describe the 10th century formation. By the way, I must admit that the very idea of old Russian people was introduced in Stalin's time. It didn't get popular. It was made by Mavrodinov in his handbook of 1945. Because in Stalin times and later in Soviet times, there was more idea of friendly nations. So that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are the three nations, so not one but three, but having the common root. Let's say brother. However, the idea of old Russian or old Kievan nation was resurrected actually in Ukrainian discourse relatively recently. This by Petr Petrovich Talochka. He's very prominent and adequate, truly academic scholar, so he indeed discussed it. And his son and actually opponent, Alexei Petrovich Talochka, actually, I think put a dot, put an end to these big discussions on the old medieval peoples of Rus, saying that we cannot really discuss the 19th century concept of nation on the material of 10th century. So he applied simply the ideas of Anderson into the discussion of nationality and nation, the territory of human rights. But nevertheless, this is the main concept on contemporary Russian handbooks. Then it promotes certain number of big discourses that Russian state, the medieval one, as you saw, the lax configuration of privately ruled lands, that it was in fact the largest state in Europe, that it was unified and centralized, which is definitely not. And it's also right that during the period of feudal rule over lands, or say falling apart of the state, despite the actual independence of the land, many of their inhabitants continue to have an idea of the unity of roots. Basically saying that the idea of unity between Russian and Ukrainian nations not only go back to 10th century, but actually preserved in certain minds of medieval people through the time of future falling apart of the state. It also describes the literature of statehood as the literature and the arts of the state as aimed to.
Anna,
yeah,
I'm sorry, you have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, as aimed to glorify patriotism and fighting the foreign enemies and fighting also the princely strifes. And finally depicts the only Western-oriented principality of Galич-Volyn, so the one which Ukrainian historiography uses as their focal point of Ukrainian statehood. It's the separate discourse. I'm not going to compare it here, but it's important that Galич principality is indeed central for Ukrainians. So it's described as very weak from the state point of view, constantly shaken by strifes between the boyars and the prince, and subjected to influence of Catholicism. And finally, even in different editions of this handbook, which is, so they are ongoing. The first one is 2016 is paper, the 2022 is digital. You see how even in phrasing, this so-called the privately ruled by princes states, they actually represented more like just the districts of a big country. So, for example, in the 2016 edition, there is the word principality used to describe this princely ruled states. However, in 2022 edition, they simply described as lands. The term is actually correct. It's indeed medieval term, not principality, but land, земля. But it's never in this handbook is explained that this is the historical term, and it's through the readings and through the use of the term in the handbook, it creates an impression that it's simply like it. Okay, that's probably everything I wanted to discuss with you, so I will be very happy to hear questions coming.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. It was very interesting. So now is the turn for questions from the audience. I will give you some time to think about it. If not, I will make my own question. And let's see. Okay, so I would like to make a joint question for Olga and Anna, because your topics are somehow related. And this is if you see any similarity of differences in the way the Middle Ages are treated by the public media and also by like the commerçant, and the way the Middle Ages are treated in handbooks, and also if you see some supplying political strategy in this, and what are the what is going to be the evolution of this topic and future tendencies. Please, Olga, go ahead.
Yeah, if Anna doesn't mind, I'd like to start because actually I wanted to ask her this question. Yeah, it's a pity actually that we cover different historical periods, but still there is a small part of my research which I didn't include in the current presentation. So I also ran a search on feudalism and the use of this concept in the media, and I can actually state that well, the newly invented term, which is mostly used in the pro-state media Kommersant, but also in Novaya Gazeta as well, is new Russian feudalism, which is generally connected to what Anna has just presented on her last slide. So the period of feudal separation in Russia, so this like 12th century with different lands competing among each other, is also replicated in the public discourse in modern media. And in the pro-Russian media, we have more or less the same trend, because this feudalism, so the separation between the regions, is used to criticize the weak central power over distant provinces in Russia, and it especially escalated in 2020-2021 during the COVID crisis, for example. So I can see several similarities, but I cannot say that they're like 100% identical. And hence it would be very interesting to compare maybe a similar period and similar historical actors.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for these questions. I was also with great interest actually listening to Olga's presentation and looking how it's related. You know what? I do feel that, for example, this discourse like Putin's written in 2021 on this unity of nations, it's penetrated both the media, the press, and of course the education, as you see. So it's general mood, let's say, of public. But also I do think that from every period the media choose a safe, let's call it, figure. I mean the recognizable figure like Alexander Nevsky, and then the entire period is associated with it, basically. Maybe a couple of more terms like feudalism or the prince or something like this, but it's just this, so entire knowledge on the period is equal to this idea, this concept, this image. And unfortunately, that's what I see handbooks promoting. Basically, it actually cuts all the complications of, even in the entity state central discourse, it cuts everything just to depict certain figures, certain narratives as a central. And I also had a question to Olga. Do you think that other media, let's call it, if we don't take Kommersant, but something, let's say, connected to church, for example, like Pravoslavia, or something connected to some other groups of interest, would they differ, do you think? Do you have some knowledge on it?
Thank you so much. It's a great question because it corresponds to my further plans on how to develop the research, well, from its current state for the future. Because there is another topic which is mentioned in the propagandistic booklets, but which would not squeeze into the limited format of the presentation. So this is the Christianization of Rus, which actually refers to the well, Russian early medieval period, so the 9th century. I would love to well, run a search and discourse analysis on that. But I guess I'll do it maybe in a month or so. So okay, at least at this point, I do believe that it would be not too bold to state that especially Orthodox media might be using the Christianization of Rus as a propagandistic tool. So this is my initial assumption, but still, like, further research needs to be done.
Thank you. I also have a short question to Brian. don't mind. I actually wanted to know, do you have any kind of like, when you teach Middle Ages and teach this kind of material, do you have any kind of guidances from school or from any kind of authority, or is entirely your pick on what themes to discuss with students for these kind of things? I just want to compare it with the situation we have in Russia. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Anna. And I must admit, hearing your research, it's shocking to me that there's a single textbook about the Middle Ages that people are allowed to use, because we do not have any guidance on how to teach the Middle Ages. We have to cover something from antiquity. We have to cover something that could be the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or early colonization, for instance. But there is no legal guideline on how to approach the Middle Ages. It's completely up to the individual teacher. What you're talking about seems like the law in Denmark from 125 years ago, where the law specifically states that history is supposed to make you feel happy about your father. Whereas today it's about the student must develop personal autonomy and must be able to participate in a modern democracy in a globalized multicultural world. So it's completely opposite. It's so fascinating seeing the differences between the systems here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So it's very nice to see that the discussion is raising. We have another question here in for the topic. So Juan, if you would like.
So I want to thank all of you, of course, for your papers. They were interesting. I have several questions, but maybe I want to begin with a question precisely for Brian, because it was somewhat on the same lines of what Anna was mentioning. Of course, on the one hand, you already answered that there are no guidelines to actually approach the Middle Ages in Denmark. But then the question that I want to extend from that is then how do you manage? Like if you could walk us through your pedagogical way, the pedagogical way in which you actually manage to use these very sensitive type of topics, like Breivik's text, like Tarrant's text, in a context in which the Middle Ages, as you mentioned, really do not have much of a guideline to actually give the students a basis on which to stand when approaching these very problematic appropriations of the medieval past. So if you could walk us through a little bit on how you actually use this very difficult material pedagogically in the classroom, and how do you actually combine it with a larger historical approach to a period that, as you say, has no guidelines on how to teach it.
Yes, thank you. And yes, this is I think this might look a bit surprising or overwhelming to somebody outside. We do have a ton of textbooks around, but none of them are really sanctioned. We have several competing private publishers to choose from. For instance, right now, some of my students are working on their own, and today they're working with an excerpt from a book, 2 different online articles, a movie trailer, and I don't know how much else around. They're just able to handle that. In terms of finding material for the Middle Ages, I'm of course lucky enough to have co-written the textbook on my own, based on what I know. So we can use that to give them the solid understanding of the 3 estates of the Middle Ages. Of course, I studied the Crusades at universities, so applying that knowledge is also something that is quite easy for me. And then once the students have all that, then we start talking about, say, Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations, and see, okay, can we track that idea through the past, or could we perhaps, if not undermine, then perhaps bring some nuance to that element, and then gradually we move up to saying, okay, so we actually have had extremists use these parts from the past or misappropriate these parts from the past, and is there any way we could perhaps counter that? So it's the solid foundation, and then we start with the memes, and then we move on to the manifestos. And I usually even give the students a choice if they want to write a project. So they could analyze Kingdom of Heaven, the movie. If they want to do that, they could get their hands on Breivik's manifesto and analyze as much of that as they like. Quite popular among the Muslim students, actually. So a small part is taking it step by step, seeing how they react, and then afterwards leaving it up to the individual students how much they want to do with this. But I think it's also quite clear here that I am a Crusades historian. So of course you can see that. I've talked to other teachers who say that they mash the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Reformation into one theme. And they say, how can you spend so many lessons on the Middle Ages? There's nothing to tell. I beg to differ. But I think that's just a part of the system. I know where to go for my sources, whereas other teachers who have a background in, say, the Cold War, the Second World War, whatever, would have trouble doing the same things that I do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brian. I think we have another question for you from Gesh. He asked, how does Denmark avoid institutional capture by extremist teachers? Because the flexibility given to teachers seems to require trusting them. Yeah.
I think a part of this is that we have to do evaluations with the students twice a year. So if the students figure out that that a teacher is racist or sexist or whatever, it will be passed on to the management. There will probably be a complaint quite quickly about that. Our exams, and I didn't say this, our exams, of course, we make our exam material on our own, but it must be checked by an external assessor, a teacher from a different school, who will then also assess the oral exams or the written exams. So there's also some oversight from other teachers. But yes, the system generally trusts that we do not try to radicalize our students. And we haven't seen any examples of extremist teachers yet. I don't actually know why. But of course, it's a risk when you decentralize everything and give so much leeway to the individual teacher. But we haven't seen the problems yet. So hopefully there just aren't a lot of extremist upper secondary teachers around.
Okay, thank you for that, Brian. If there are other questions or comments, again, don't forget that you can raise your hand using the button to raise your hand, or you can also write that question in the chat. In the meantime, then I think I will ask another question, and this is for both for Olga and for Anna. Both of you mentioned instances in which the Soviet past creeps into the way in which these topics are discussed, right? So, for example, where you, Olga, were talking about the figure of Ivan the Terrible, the first thing that came to mind were Eisenstein's movies during the Stalinist period, right? Because it seems to be a very similar form of rehabilitation of the image of Ivan the Great. And of course, Anna also mentioned that several of the ideas of the one Russian statehood come not only from Putin right now, but seem also to have been there in the period of the Soviet Union. So what I would ask, and of course, this comes from, I'm not an expert in Soviet history. I mean, from the outside, I would assume that Marxism is an ideology that is anti-tribalist in the sense that, for example, Putin or the far right understands tribalism because it is focused on class. But I would like to ask if you see what are like the continuities and breakups that you would see, for example, in the way in which Putin's regime today uses this type of medievalist rhetoric to explain its model of statehood and its actions in Ukraine today, and in the way in which the Soviet Union used to do it.
Okay, I mean, for my part, I must admit that, as it at least seems to me, the Geschichte politics of Putin is very eclectic. So inclusion of history into politics, historical politics. So it includes great elements from, let's say, imperial discourses before 1917, before the revolution. It includes some chunks from Stalinist discourses. Others are Brezhnev's time, others are new. So he recently used, for example, the ideas from post-colonial theories in his new strategic vision of Russia, saying that he strives for post-colonialist world. So it's absolute eclecticism in any kind of terminology and concepts. His elites just adjust to serve Putin's cause. That's all.
Thank you so much, Anna, for giving this context, because it is extremely important to understand how versatile Putin's ideology is. So we cannot draw like a strict line between the Soviet, like Stalinist ideology and manipulations with history and the current ones we have like demonstrated by Putin. But what I can stress based on the selection of materials I have at hand is the similarity, but not equality, as to the discourses about Ivan the Terrible, Oprichnina, and Alexander Nevsky, because Juan has correctly mentioned Eisenstein's movie, but also during the Soviet period, not only the figure of Ivan the Terrible, but also the figure of Alexander Nevsky was reproduced mostly through cinema. And while Ivan the Terrible demonstrated the image of a truly terrible person, but a just king, Alexander Nevsky was used in the 40s mostly, or around that period, to showcase how a true Russian knight can oppose the hordes of attacking forces coming from the West. So the focus on the relationships with the Mongols was not so heightened as it is, for example, today. So today, Alexander Nevsky is again used as a person capable of defending Russia from the Western forces. So this is a huge similarity to the Soviet discourse. But I would say that the representation of this figure has changed throughout this huge period, because now the bigger stress is rather on his ability to manipulate between the forces between the East and the West. And he is mostly referred to not only as a patriotic warrior, so the example which I brought in my presentation, but also as a capable diplomat, which can promote the agenda beneficial for his country. So we can trace some similarities, but I would say that the discourse is evolving, and it's very interesting to observe how it's proceeding.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Because if not, then I have a follow-up question to that just came to mind, thinking about what you, Olga, were saying. And well, if they are not, then I will ask it. And in the essence, is something that also catches my attention is the prevalence of these figures, right? Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible, when you could also use other figures from the Russian past to actually illustrate their conflict with the West. Then my question would be, of course, as an outsider, why the obsession with these two specific figures? Because these are also the two figures on which Eisenstein made a movie on, right? You have a movie on Alexander Nevsky, two movies on Ivan the Terrible, and they seem to be also the figures, as Olga, as you presented, that are also being, again, rehabilitated or reused by the Putin regime. I don't know if this is something because of the figures themselves, because of the Middle Ages as these nebulous but always usable period, or if also there is other historical Russian figures that are used in an analogous form as these two.
Thank you so much for this interesting question, and I would say, well, it gives me an opportunity to expand like a lot on this, which I'll try to avoid doing. And I guess Anna can also correct me or comment on what I'm going to say. So first of all, I would say that I have presented on Ivan the Terrible and Alexander Nevsky because the main topic of our today's event is the Middle Ages. But I must admit that the historical discourse, so the all of the instruments of historical politics that Putin is using are multifaceted, I would say. And the Middle Ages is just a small, tiny piece of this. Because if we look at other periods, we can find actors from the 18th century. So, for example, just to give you one persona, Peter the Great, who turned Russia into the empire. And well, such discourse that Putin tries to adhere to Peter the Great is also promoted in some of the articles. But well, for the sake of brevity and also chronological framework, I decided not to focus on it, obviously. So this is the first remark, and the second remark is my personal assumption. So I believe that maybe the Middle Ages as period per se are pretty much chronologically far away from our contemporary period, and they also contain many well, historiographical myths, I would say, although I would be very cautious with this term. And therefore, given this distance and the flexibility, I mean, historiographical flexibility the period gives us, maybe that is why the state is trying to manipulate it, because people do not know much about the Middle Ages and its actors. Mostly they take from the public discourse, the TV series, films, video games they are consuming. And that is why it's much easier to construct a new historical memory as opposed to other periods which are much more closer to our historical memory, so we can know more about it and we can trace more historical manipulations.
Yeah, I would just add a bit. There is a very interesting common, let's say, tendency for all post-Soviet countries. We actually like to narrate history through figures and processes. Processes inherited from Marxist interpretation of history. Now they describe differently, but they still call processes like centralization, for example. And figures is from 19th century tradition. So when we narrate the history through big figures. And why is Alexander Nevsky important in this narrative? He's the only one in this medieval history who makes a big contribution to history of state in his quality of not Kievan, but Novgorod prince, because all others are whatever Kievan princes. So if we look at Ukrainian, let's say, discourse, it would be Yaroslav the Wise, Vladimir the Great, all the same personalities, exactly in their periods of life when they are Kievan. So it's just, mirroring one and second. And also the same for Ivan the Great. So he's last Rurikid, because after him happens some kind of change of dynasty, under whom the medieval state was the greatest in the size. It's all this expansionist policies, because he took Kazan, Astrakhan, tried his luck with Napoleon War. And so it's just expansion of the state as a self-value in ideology. So I think that's why the selection was made like this.
Thank you, Anna and Olga. We have two questions from James Burley, one for Olga, one for Brian, but since we are running out of time, I'm going to present only the one for Brian. So James asked, does your teaching with extremism work wholly on pan-whiteness or pan-European models, for example, Breivik and the Crusaders, where there are very international and often quite Anglophone discourses, or are there also some other specifically Danish aspects and examples of medievalism that you use and tackle with your students?
Yes, I didn't think we had time for that, so I very quickly typed the reply, but I'd be happy to elaborate on that. A part of it, I think that many Danes are so good at English that we are practically part of the Anglophone world, that most of my students speak English online or write English online in their spare time. So so it works in that regard. I do tackle the Vikings, especially because the legacy of the Vikings, also globally, there's a lot of far-right extremism and whiteness combined with the Vikings, whereas the legacy or the memory of the Vikings is very complicated in Denmark. Yes, we do have a right-wing sector who have also taken up the Asatru, believing in Old Norse gods and sporting tattoos and insisting that they are Vikings in a quest for bringing back trad values and whiteness and whatnot. But you also have another part of Vikings where it's commercialized, or where it's used as a time when society was more tolerant and more egalitarian. So it is complex with the Vikings, but it's something we're looking into right now because it's such a good example of the same historical group or event that is used in many different ways from many different sides.
Okay, then thank you very much for all your answers and for all the questions of the audience. Remember that you can write your email in the chat and make direct questions to our participants. So I will call you for the next panel at 1:30, which will be about medieval gaming and pedagogy. And thank you very much. So we finish here.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.